If you read Exodus chapter 12 to 13, you can see that very clearly. There were no burnt offerings. People were eating, non-Kohen, non-Levi people were eating Paschal lamb, kosher lamb, fit for temple offerings. But it was not a sacrificial offering. But anyway, the stories in the Gospels are argumentatively inconsistent between, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And John is the most beloved of all the Gospels, I had an interesting discussion with a good friend of mine, a Christian. We used to work together in my previous company. And we, tongue-in-cheek, we go back.
Correct Jew with an Orthodox flair. We discuss the various differences between the New Testament and the Jewish Bible.
Christological, theological differences between Jewish beliefs and Christian beliefs. Who does not love a good debate as long as it's done in love and mutual respect? There is something very interesting.
The Gospel of John 13:29.
Before I get to that, this Torah Watchman show edition is about Passover. When was Jesus crucified? When was he taken away to be crucified? This may be a very obvious question. Most Christians would say they know exactly when Jesus was crucified, right? Why? Because there were live witnesses there. There were consistent testimonies across the board. But first of all, before I get to this, Passover is the most holiest of all holidays in Judaism, okay? It's a high holiday. It's known as Pesach. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but I want to point out quickly, and I've always pointed this out before, that in Egypt, did you know the sheep were considered sacred animals?
In fact, there was a humanoid hybrid ram creature known as Kahanum,
that Pharaoh, during the time of Moshe, when the Hebrews were in Goshen as slaves, they worshiped this creature. That's why they were forbidden. They forbade the Jews to sacrifice lamb in Goshen in Egypt. Okay, that was the death sentence, a capital punishment if they caught you doing that, because the animals were considered sacred. When Pharaoh and Moshe went back and forth, he said, why can't you just worship your God here in Goshen? Why can't you just do this? Trying to compromise, testing each other's positions on different things. And then Moshe admitted, we're shepherds, and if we sacrifice one of these lambs, you will kill us. You will kill us. Quickly, the Passover story, as you know, Jews know this. It's passed on from generation to generation. The first Passover supper or dinner, or kiddush per se, the lamb was literally chosen, the best of the breed, spotless, clean, and it was used for food, for consumption. It was not used for sacrificial offerings. It was not burned in that way, okay? It was not offered to God as a sacrifice to atone for anyone's sin. Why was the blood of the lamb put on the doorpost of every home, every observant Jewish home that still believed in God in Goshen? Well, it was the mark, of course, that these Jews were committed to God and was keeping the commandments of Passover, the first Passover there, when the angel of death came and killed all the firstborn of Egypt, every slave of the Egyptian that were firstborn, every animal that was killed, the firstborn, unless they had the lamb's blood on the doorpost, okay? The reason the lamb's blood, again, was not put on the doorpost for those Jews in that house to be forgiven of any sin. It was an admonition against the Pharaoh himself to say that here's your God that we had killed for food for Passover, not sacrificed, but killed and spread its blood on the doorposts of the Jews, something that you put faith and trust in to save you from your enemies. Here we are putting the blood. We're not afraid of putting the blood of this lamb on our doorpost. It was God's admonition against the false gods of Egypt. So that is one contextual baseline of thinking. Let's go back to the Gospel, John, chapter 13, verse 39, if I'm correct. Now, as you know, first of all, the four Gospels were all written anonymously. No one to this day who knew the true author of these Gospels. Okay, they were incidentally composed or written on parchment after the Apostle Paul died around 55 CE or AD if you're Christian, okay? So the Gospels are written after, Gospel Mark was written around, I would say, 65, 67 CE, right before the Second Temple was destroyed. But Matthew and Luke were written after, about 30 years after that. And the Gospel of John was not written until 95, 97 CE, almost at the turn of the first century. This is not my opinion. You can research it yourself. And most honest scholars, Christian scholars, PhD professors will admit this is true. By Roman Catholic tradition, of course, they attribute the four Gospels, synoptic Gospels, to be written by the disciples. Well, that was physically impossible. I don't want to get into that because they were written and composed long after Jesus died, long after the disciples lived. People didn't live very long, maybe to 25 years of age at the best. Okay? So what I want to point out here is fascinating. Pesach occurs in the Hebrew calendar every single year the same time. It's the 15th of the month of Nisan. Okay? That's always in the spring. Okay? That's why we have a floating calendar. That's why sometimes we have 13 months in a given year because of leap year. That's how we cope with the Gregorian calendar imposed upon us, incidentally, by Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire. But anyway, not germane. But anyway, the 15th of Nisan, just write that down in the middle note. The Passover story is telling you about, and Shemalisha Exodus chapter 12 through 13. If you want to read that in your Old Testament, you're Christian, you can read that and find that. It's always on the 15th of Nisan, okay? We've been celebrating Passover on the 15th Nisan for 3,500 years, roughly, okay? It's the same date. But, for the Christology or the theology whoever wrote Matthew or Mark and Luke was completely different than whoever wrote the Gospel of John. Why am I saying that? Well, if you read the Gospel of Mark, which was the first Gospel written, if you actually want to look at chronological order based on the first and the last as far as the historical timeline, the Gospel of Mark would be written first, followed by Matthew and Luke. And then that's, of course, after the Apostle Paul, like I said before. Why am I pointing this out? Stay with me. So Mark, first of all, talks about the Passion narrative, the Lord's Supper, per se, and that storyline that was manufactured by anomalous authors, that Jesus was supposedly having the Lord's Supper, Passover, the festival, as is referred in John, on the first day of Passover, on the 15th of Nisan, okay? So I understand on a high holiday, especially Passover, as sacred as that month, that festival is for Jews, even 2,000 years ago. Festival is for Jews, even 2,000 years ago. There was a complete work stoppage. You could not go to a store to buy, barter, trade, sell anything, okay? So in other words, all the lamb that was to be slaughtered and prepared as a food source for the Passover meal, okay? The so-called lamb shank bone. At that time, the kosher lamb, that was used for the meals, for the Passover week. So, but the story there, and if you read Matthew, if you read Mark and Luke, is consistent that it's the first day of Passover that Jesus had his famous Lord's Supper, okay? And Da Vinci. So why is this important that I'm pointing it out? Well, Judas Iscariot, whatever, the money changer, the secretary or whatever, left suddenly toward the end of the meal to go and do his nefarious deeds. He betrayed Jesus or whatever. But in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verse 39, tells a different story. The Lord's Supper occurred on the 14th of Nisan, okay? And according to that scripture there, you can read it yourself, I encourage you to, Judas took the money and they asked him to take the money since he controlled the treasury of the disciples, for Jesus' benefit. And he said, go out and purchase supplies for the festival. Why? Because the 14th of Nisan was the last day that sheep were being slaughtered for Passover. The last day they had matzah prepared, unleavened bread, and all the other supplies, the vegetables and things of that nature. So Gospel of John has a different story. On the 14th of Nisan, Judas supposedly says deliberately there, going out to purchase supplies for the festival. It does not say that at all in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? So these stories are very inconsistent. Now, I've talked to other people why they're inconsistent, and they acknowledge they're inconsistent. He said, well, there's different personal perspectives, personalities, and all of this. But if you don't get it right, when Jesus was crucified, in John, he was led away. He was led away by the betrayal of Judas Iscariot on the night of the first day of Passover. I'm sorry, in John, he was led away on the 14th of Nisan before Passover even started, okay? He was betrayed then. If you read Matthew, Luke, and Mark, it was the first day of Passover that he was betrayed by Judas Iscariot. So the point I'm trying to make here, okay, if you're going to believe any story, first of all, you need to know who the author was. And if you tell a story about something as critically important as this, the passion narrative of Jesus, if you argue about when Jesus was crucified, then you argue about everything and your whole story unravels because people think you're a liar or a storyteller, okay? But, supposedly these were live witnesses that were testifying that these events were really occurring as portrayed in the four Gospels. But if there were live witnesses testifying about this, then why did the live witness, whoever contributed to the authorship of the Gospel of John, why did they tell a different story when Jesus was supposedly crucified? Listen, this caused a huge firestorm with Constantine when he's assembling the Council of Nicaea around 325 CE, to the point that he changed the entire date calendar system from Hebrew to Gregorian so that you would have a consistent day when you would celebrate Easter. Please research this for yourself, okay? Be very honest with yourself. Again, I established what Pesach is, what it's not. That had nothing to do with remission of sins, had nothing to do with sacrificial offerings. If you read Exodus chapter 12 to 13, you could see that very clearly. There were no burnt offerings. People were eating, non-Kohen, non-Levi people were eating Paschal lamb, kosher lamb, fit for temple offering. But it was not a sacrificial offering. But anyway, the stories and the Gospels are argumentatively inconsistent between, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And John is the most beloved of all the Gospels, Anyway, read this out for yourself. Research it yourself. Send me your feedback to ben-Emmett@gmail.com. Please pose any questions, any concerns. I don't mean to offend anyone by this video, but if you have any other interesting topic of interest, please post them to me. Send me an email and ask me questions, and I'll research, and perhaps I can do a video on it. Anyway, ben-Emmett signing out on the Torah Watchman channel. Please share my videos. It's a wealth of knowledge. I do a lot of research. I think about this all the time. I want to make sure that I speak the truth to you, okay? Something more truthful than the gospel's truth, okay? Listen, please stay with me on this. I'm on your side. I'm on the side of truth. Remember, there cannot be any New Testament. The New Testament cannot be true if your Old Testament is false. But the Old Testament can be true, totally independent of the New Testament being false. So that's the way it goes. Anyways, y'all, ben-Emmett signing out. You have a wonderful day. God bless you. Shalom Aleichem.
If you've enjoyed this program, please click like and subscribe.